Good morning. Good morning, Theresa.
Good morning, Cynthia.
Good morning, LinkedIn. I'm Cynthia Forstmann. I am a co-founder of CultureTalk, and I am here. I'm dialed in today from Denver, Colorado, where I'm based. And I'm here with Theresa Agresta, who is my co-founder and partner, dialed in from Saratoga Springs, New York.
Yeah.
So welcome to the conversation. If you are new to Culture Talk, or a program we've been running for, Theresa, I want to say it's like 2 years now, our Thursdays with Culture Talk.
2 plus, I'd say.
2 plus years, 2 plus years. We have been going live every other Thursday. Is about the cadence that we're doing, jumping on with ourselves and with different people who are working in the culture, leadership, team building, merging cultures, transforming cultures space to talk about why culture is hard, why culture is so difficult to talk about, and some things that we're learning through the work we're doing. So a quick intro about Culture Talk. Culture Talk is, going to help you define, design, and transform workplace cultures. We offer a modern platform of assessment tools that create a common culture language that make it talkable. And the language can be used for coaching leaders, for creating team experiences that really pull teams together and help them collaborate, help them work through differences. And also a big piece of the work that's getting done with Culture Talk is around organizational change. And we're going to talk about organizational change today. Specifically, we have been working our way since the beginning of 2023 through what we're calling 6 critical paths. And we are on our last, we're on number 6, which is Culture Talk. How does Culture Talk and using these assessment tools as part of a baseline culture audit, how does it help leaders who've gone through an M&A experience really take culture and turn it into something tangible and strategic that they can leverage to get newly merged teams working better together, and also to surface, the different issues that crop up during an M&A. So that's the path we're on today is Culture Talk for M&A. Theresa, tell us a little bit about M&A and why it's so difficult. What are
some of the statistics around M&A would make you pause. They would definitely make you question, is this something that really makes sense? And yet we see the volume, a little bit of ups and downs over the past year and post-pandemic, but generally a trajectory that shows that there is a lot of activity around M&A. So the fact that according to, I think it's Harvard Business Review, 70 to 90, now that's a big, range, 70 to 90, but still 70% at a minimum of organizations that have a stated goal for undertaking an M&A fail to reach that goal. And close, upwards toward 90% fail to reach the goals they established when they, decided to go down this road to begin with. That's pretty staggering. And the other thing that we know, and again, this is backed up by a lot of research, in particular, Gallup came out about 1.5 years ago with research that said that the difference in cultures, in organizational cultures, are one of the highest contributing factors to why that's true. So Gallup's numbers sort of pointing back to HBR's numbers, saying that, yes, in fact, this sticky wicket, this intangible, tough to talk about topic of culture is costing in real dollars and cents, as well as just an enormous amount of effort and, goals and hopes that are pinned on this transaction. So when we think about that, the rationale for understanding what's happening in the culture is really strong. And there should be some good incentive to get it right.
I love also how Gallup calls it multi-layered.
Multi-layered. Great.
There's
Yeah. Great word.
first, right? What is this multi-layered aspect of culture? Sometimes Theresa and I will talk about what is culture. And we think about two boxes, and the inner box says the word expect, and the outer box says the word tolerate. And we really think about, in that expect box are lots of things that, maybe two companies coming together have actually written down about their own cultures. They've said, here's our mission, our vision, our values, our purpose. Here's,
they're on the wall. We can point to them,
we believe in. And I think that a lot of times leaders are so in a due diligence process, are so, they've got their eye on maybe the operational gain of acquiring a company or becoming part of a larger company, and the dollars that are potentially available to them as they do those things. And so I think they tend to give that cursory nod to culture, and they're looking just at that box we call expect, and they're saying, "Oh yes, we like them. We like
that too.
We're totally aligned."
Yeah.
Theresa, what's the problem then? What happens when they come together?
The problem is we don't live in the expect box, right? Fortunately or unfortunately, we live outside that box in a more nebulous space that we call tolerate. And it's the behaviors that we'll tolerate in service of, the things that we'll wink, wink, put up with that are outside of our stated culture, values, mission, but we'll tolerate them because we feel like, there's some rationale to move past what our stated values are. And so in that lived experience outside of the expect box is what we measure when we look at organizational culture, but it's not written down anywhere. It's kind of those unwritten rules, the things that we encounter in our experience of working for the organization. And they might be quite at odds with sometimes, or very different from what is stated and written down.
It's just amazing, right? It's amazing how much work we do to try to write it down.
Right.
And then to
pat ourselves on the back.
But totally. And then to recognize that there's this whole layer of culture that is maybe described, how do things really work around here? And in a merger, what happens is people, give that cursory nod, like, I like you, I like your culture. And then when they actually are pulling things together and they're starting to see that there's gaps between how they make decisions, what gets prioritized, who gets promoted, what kind of leaders, what kind of leadership style is actually at play in two companies that are coming together.
Right.
How do they change, grow, adapt? How do people work together and the team work together? And that's where I think, after the merger, people will start getting really nervous and uncomfortable because they're working.
Well, and I think one other thing about that whole expect tolerate, when might we live at the edges of what we say in the tolerate space? When we're under stress. What comes out when we're under stress? Well, it's usually not our best sides. So to your point, mergers bring up stress, and people are kind of feeling unsure, being on high awareness, like, looking around or running at high speed to try and get these things done. And so that's when we really see what we oftentimes call at Culture Talk, the shadow sides of those behaviors, things that we tolerate because we're under stress, perhaps, that we're under a pressure cooker. And that's when it really comes up.
And everybody gets hyper focused too on themselves. Like, what's my role in this? And are people,
am I safe?
Am I doing the right things? You know what I mean? That are going to be valued, et cetera. So, when it comes to mergers, it's a little hard. It's hard to introduce culture in the heat of the moment, right? Mm-hmm. It's hard when leaders are pushing very quickly down a path to make it happen. They've got specific goals and they're highly motivated to make it happen, it's hard to get them sort of stop. And but what happens then after the merger is as the cultural tensions start to like pop to the surface, at some point you can ignore it. You just can't.
Yeah. Well, and so, I mean, even before that, I'm going to back us up just a little to before the merger, because we'll get this question a lot. Like, wouldn't it be a great idea to do some auditing of the cultures as part of due diligence? And of course, we love that idea at Culture Talk. We think that would be a great idea, but it frequently, there's a big, sort of like, not right now.
Gonna look at that.
That's right. That might slow us down. That might, pause, put us in a pause and, dash the deal, if you will. And so there, even though that might be a really strong time to do it, I think you're right. I think it's after the merger when the tensions start to rise and we start to notice and finger point and feel scared. Whether it's personal fear or sort of fear for us, like a protection mechanism about the way we do things versus how they do things. I think that, that becomes obviously the second most ideal time to address it.
Well, and some of the things, some of the ways companies might recognize that things are awry, maybe our engagement and our productivity start going down. Maybe we start losing key personnel, employees who have really been big contributors who, they've been on the lookout for another job because they all feel that tension. And that's where, a merged entity loses its opportunity. What was going to be a 1 + 1 = 3 is turning into a minus situation really, really quickly.
Right. And, another thing I think is important to remember is we think operationally, so we can look at processes. And so maybe it feels like, okay, just integrating these processes is logical. Right. We should be able to look at the processes and bring them together and not really understand that what's happening from a cultural perspective is lying underneath the surface, right? So one of those layers that Gallup referenced. And when we try to take that apart, it's not necessarily logical. And it feels emotional. It feels personal. And so the ability to measure what's not tangible and logical is much more challenging than it looks from the surface when it just looks like, okay, well, we've got to, pull these systems together. This idea, and you'll remember where it comes from, but the idea that, it's about managing the human beings working together is never more pressing than when you're actually trying to bring them together and tell them that this is going to be fun and this is going to be
everybody.
Yeah, exactly.
They're living in the tension. And I love that you're just bringing it's human. Pulling together is about pulling together human beings, and believe it or not, they have to want to come together. And just saying we're doing it is not necessarily going to get it done. They have to have a heart in it. They have to have a stake in it. They have to understand and be able to talk about that underlying element that is keeping them up at night or is making things really uncomfortable. So in the work we do at Culture Talk, our partners do, and we've done with clients in an M&A, we always start with what we call a baseline culture audit. Right. And when we are doing a baseline culture audit for the specific purpose of really understanding two cultures that have merged together, we do it a little bit differently. Theresa, I wonder if you could talk us through kind of the baseline culture audit and what are the goals, so to speak, when it's a merged situation?
Right. So the baseline culture audit, the steps are the same that we use when we're looking at an individual culture, or essentially we're doing it twice. So we are measuring what are the recurring themes and patterns and stories that are showing up in each of the origin organizations. So before we knew you even existed, how were we rolling? What was important to us? What were the lived experience of our team, and how did we use that to our advantage? It was working for us. That's why we liked you to begin with. We could see, you were doing things well and it's working. And the same thing for the second organization. So we measure both. We do an audit of what are the organizational patterns that we can measure through a survey. And in all likelihood, we might find some things that are the same, but we might find some significant differences in what stories and what patterns that they are living. And then we do a validation experience. That could be handled in a number of different ways. Could be that you validate individually. So let's get some clarity around the patterns we measured and land in a culture profile for each organization. Or you could actually bring those teams together and hear that validation happening live, real time, for what's happening or what was happening over here that is important to us, that is reflected in our policies, that is the way that our team operates underneath the surface, and that we like, we want to hold on to. We don't want to lose these aspects of who we are and, what we feel where our value lies, again, in both places. So when you're able to bring the teams together to do that validation part, they get to hear each other validate. They get to understand where does the passion lie? Where are people really connected to the way we did things? And why? Like, what are the motivators?
Because a lot of times when two teams are behaving differently, they just have a different why. They have a different thing that they're focused on and motivated by. And as Theresa's talking about patterns, cultural patterns, we're specifically referring to a framework we use at CultureTalk, which is 12 archetypal patterns. Archetypes just being human stories that there's no good or bad archetype. There's no better archetype. There's no archetype you should be if you're in
That's right, especially in a merger. You just
yeah,
you show the way you are, right?
And I want to point, when you have two different originating organizations that measure and validate which of these human patterns are most prominent for them, it helps them see themselves, right? That's one of the goals, is that now I go, oh, that's why we do what we do, because we have a high every person, or because we're motivated by a hero pattern, or whatever it is. That ability to first see themselves and then see what happens when we bring those patterns together.
Right.
What bubbles to the surface.
Right. And where does the tension lie? Without making each other wrong, because without measuring the patterns and understanding, what those stories are and why we're attached to those stories, our tendency as human beings is to see the other and to make them wrong. That's right. It's different. It's wrong. Well, when they come around to seeing the world from our point of view, things will be okay. And really, that needs to happen. We need to kind of level the playing field and allow both organizations to experience the underlying drivers and the stories and the patterns and what we're attached to and why, before we can expect anyone to let go of those things, or before we can expect anyone to, intentionally bring those two together. And that's the opportunity. So what are the gaps and why?
I'm thinking about a phrase that Mercedes Martin, who's one of our certified partners, uses often. She says, we need both. The archetypes can be both a mirror and a lens, right? So they're a mirror that allow us to reflect on what is our pattern, but also lens through which to start to see what other patterns are possible, what other patterns exist in this company we've merged with. So let's get to the gaps, because that's kind of where the rubber meets the road sometimes when you're doing this kind of cultural integration work, is we need a neutral way of looking at where those tensions lie.
Yeah. I love that you called it a neutral way. That's a really good way to express it, because now it's not about what I think and what I see, but it's a clear stated measurement using a common language. and we're going to look at both sides. So it's kind of leveling the playing field. It is neutral.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the finger pointing goes down. The tension starts to go down and the understanding starts to come up, because it's not about being judged, but rather about being understood, being heard. And it's a great way to open the door to true listening.
Yeah, that it creates a clarity. It creates a clarity for everyone, that regardless of what organization they started with, kind of a real way of seeing things, that they, almost like it made the invisible visible, because now we have a story, we have a pattern, we know if it's a strength or a shadow, and we have a way of talking about it. I'd love to share, Theresa, a quick case study about someone doing the work in Australia. So we have a partner in Australia, and she had been working with, let's just call them Company A. It was a developer, right? A real estate development firm, Company A. They had been doing a lot of work around purpose and values and really defining their meaning as an organization. And they did have as a growth strategy acquiring, and they had acquired a construction management organization, right? Also a very successful firm, and one that they had been vendor partnered with for a while. They had already been working.
They were already friends.
Yeah, they already liked each other. So when it came to that merger, they gave that cursory nod of, yeah, we like you, and let's do this. And I'll fast forward, because our partner was sort of in and out of the organization, consulting at various points and then being gone. And sure enough, a couple of months, maybe 6-8 months post-merger, she gets that phone call. We have a problem. We don't know what's going on, but our teams are not working well together. So she suggested to go in and do this baseline culture audit with both of the organizations. And when they measured their archetypal patterns, and what we do is we validate for 3 storylines that are most prominent in the organization. They shared one storyline we call the hero. That's the get her done kind of archetype. That's the goal-oriented team, self-forming teams, inspirational, get it done at all costs kind of energy in an organization. But their second 2 patterns did not match. One had an innocent, one had an every person. One had a sage, one had a jester. Maybe even in that sage jester, you can start to hear.
Lots going on there, right?
We have a different way of getting things done here. And so she first did the baseline culture audit and just laid it all out on the table, right? Laid it all out on the table. Where do the patterns that what are the stories? And where are we aligned? And more important, well, actually, the alignment was important. I mean, it was really good when she did these little validation sessions with the 2 companies for them to see they shared a lot of strengths. They did. That cursory nod wasn't totally off base. There were a lot of things that they worked well on together. But what it also brought to, so anywhere where there was like strength in common, they were like, let's keep doing that. It's working. But what they started to then see was where those tensions were. And it gave them very practical and tactical information about how to address the tensions. So, the SAGE organization, they wanted all the facts, and they needed all of that up front to make choices and to choose direction. The organization that had a higher jester was a little bit more, in the moment and not as, didn't have the same
role with it, perhaps.
Yeah. And so
need as much detail.
When they put that on the table and identified the specific behaviors that were troublesome, now they can come to some agreement. Now they can go, whoa, we better slow down, or we better stop, and we better address this gap that exists between how things get done around here.
Right.
And
right. What I love about that example right there is literally you can, as you're going through that validation experience, you can say, yeah, and this that happened last week, because I paused because I was looking for one, two, three pieces of information that we always have.
Right.
And the other person could say, well, I got really frustrated because we never have that. And we get it, 2 months from now, we're okay with that. And just literally to be able to address something, very specific that happened would make a world of difference to understanding, why do we feel like you're too uptight or you're not buttoned up.
Go with the flow, or,
Right.
whatever.
Right.
Yeah. And I will just close on that and say that, what we heard in feedback was the number one thing this did for them was really create the clarity around how to get through, how to integrate, what things needed to be addressed. So, and that was a case where, they were 6 to 8 months post-merger. I'd love, Theresa, if you would share kind of like the 8-year post-merger kind of tensions that had arisen.
Yeah. So, we talked about when to do this, right? Before, during, after. Some people wait until they're experiencing maybe a lot of pain or they feel things have really gotten off the tracks before they have enough, pressure to act. And so another story comes from our work when we were addressing a large transportation company that had grown through acquisition and over time was operating 3 distinct companies. And the pain of bringing them together was such that they had agreed to just leave them alone. Like, wow, they are so challenging that we're just going to let them operate over there. And we're going to pay for 3 sets of, financial systems and HR programs and all the things that organizations need that they had in triplicate. And that was the nature of their pain. It was so painful to try and bring them together that they thought we're better off not even doing it. Well, along comes a new CEO.
Yeah,
and
right.
He's tasked with let's cut the fat here, people. We have so many over, indexed expenditures that are just tied to the fact that we're ignoring the pain of trying to bring these together. So he was tasked with operationally bringing them together. And we were tasked with looking at how do we overcome what has become just almost like a war zone of distrust, dislike, finger pointing, name calling, just
like the very worst.
Yeah, exactly. We really don't like you people. And we've got a whole bunch of, experiences and years that we can point to as to why. So really fascinating. We did the baseline culture audit, but this time we did it in triplicate. And we measured the cultures of the organizations, sort of the parent company and then the 2 acquired companies who were literally doing the same business and at times even competing with one another. And what was really fascinating about that is when we brought them together to share the results, their mouths were hanging open when they recognized that we measured the same patterns at all 3 organizations. And so we were looking at a group that shared the ruler, the hero, and I can't remember what the third one was.
The creator.
The creator. And when we could help them to see what they had in common, they were probably, couldn't be more surprised to see what had happened. But they started to recognize their motivations were the same.
Right.
Their operations might be different, but it was workable. In fact, it was very workable.
I'll never forget that meeting and sort of the collective breath that everybody in the room took when they could start to let some of their defenses down.
Yeah.
Remember that?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And giving the new CEO the, ability to move forward, but not fighting the leadership teams at each of the separate companies, but with them on board, with them agreeing that, in fact, we can make this work and it's not going to be such a hard undertaking that we have been fearing. And so the willingness to do it is what shifted.
I think there were certainly gaps in the way they worked, right? But the gaps weren't so far off and they could find their way through because there was so much alignment how they showed up and thought and what was important to them. That was a really amazing outcome.
Yeah. Well, and, in thinking about it as well, potentially leaning into maybe the shadow side of that hero, just the sheer competitiveness of, like I said, they were competing with each other for business. Even though they're part of the same company.
The shadow side of the ruler, where everybody's got this, sense of being in charge and ownership and not wanting to be told what to do. And that was a really powerful experience. And I think for that organization, to wrestle through all of that invisible emotional behavioral resistance to coming together and
attachments, right? We're attached to the way things are, human, very human. So some of the things that also supported then the implementation, post-merger, and I think these are important too, is to understand we need some kind of action plan to address the gaps that we identify. What's that going to look like? How can we tackle them in a way that allows us to get at sort of the biggest obstacles first, but not try and take down the whole, thing at once? So creating some, clarity around, hey, wow, this is the biggest thing that's in our way. What is going to be our tactical approach to working through this? And then what are we going to do next? Or maybe there's, tasks assigned to certain teams, but each one is focused on a particular obstacle that they're going to work through with some clarity around, what are the steps that are going to be necessary? What are you going to need to hear from us? How are we going to need to, check that box for you to feel safe to move forward, or whatever those, what happens when patterns come together, what we've learned about how you operate, and how can we help each other?
Absolutely. And I like that you said, like, kind of peel off the big ones first.
Yeah.
Because,
we start to make progress.
It's a process. It's a process. Coming together is a process, and learning to work with new teams. It takes time, but it can be done. And we will. I think we're going to pick back up on some more M&A cultural issues in terms of, hey, once you do that baseline culture audit, what are some of the
next?
What are some of the things you can do to really start to get those teams integrated? So we'll pick up that on another live, but just as we're closing today's conversation, whether you're live or you're joining us later, do you need a baseline culture audit? Are you part of an organization that is thinking about merging, acquiring? Did you go through one and you can identify some of those points of pain we described? Reach out. We'd be happy to talk to you about what's involved, what would be involved for your organization, and what kind of outcomes you could anticipate by using this CultureTalk system to really develop that common culture language and get people, teams, and leaders driving strategy forward together. So reach out to Theresa, reach out to myself. Theresa, any parting words on this Thursday morning?
No, just acknowledgement, I think, that when you are in an M&A situation, it is challenging. And if you're in a situation where you feel like you're, kind of banging your head against the wall a little bit and you don't feel like there is a way out, we do know that this process, consistently applied, really begins to move things forward. So we look forward to hearing from you. Looked forward to hearing some of your stories and maybe sharing some ways that these ideas can help you too.
Make it a great day. We'll be back.
Thanks for being here. Bye-bye.
Bye.